Hello, I'm Dr. Nicole McFadyen, and today I'm here to provide you with a brief introduction to unpacking and understanding human trafficking in Canada. So we'll start with a brief introduction, then look at a couple legal definitions of human trafficking. Next, I'll discuss a little bit of the history of anti-trafficking efforts in Canada. From here, we'll look at popular understandings and misconceptions of human trafficking, and then we'll unpack these stereotypes so that we can better understand the reality. After this, we'll look at why this all matters for you in your day-to-day life, as well as what you can do and where you can go to learn more about these important issues. So a little bit about me. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, which at its simplest means I study people and culture. I've been researching human trafficking and related issues in Canada and internationally for over 10 years now. Throughout this research, I've worked directly with survivors of human trafficking, a wide array of frontline support service providers, as well as migrant workers and people who work in different areas of the sex trades. I've been directly involved in transforming anti-trafficking efforts in different non-governmental organizations in Canada, and I'm the co-editor of the policy brief Challenging Trafficking in Canada, which has been widely circulated among government bodies and non-governmental organizations at the provincial, national, and international levels. I teach part-time in the Department of Anthropology at York University, and I'm a researcher and project manager at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. All right, let's start with establishing a bit of an understanding about what human trafficking is by looking at Canada's legal definition and the United Nations definition. So in Canada, human trafficking is defined as involving the recruitment, transportation, harboring, and/or exercising control, direction, or influence over the movements of a person to exploit that person. In other words, anyone over the age of 18 whose labor, including agricultural, construction, domestic, sexual, etc., is exploited through any means of force, fraud, or coercion, and anyone under the age of 18 who, because they're legally considered unable to consent, engages in any form of transactional sex. The United Nations definition is the basis of Canada's definition, but it is, as you can see, quite a bit longer. I won't read the whole thing. A key difference here is that the broader United Nations definition also includes the forced removal of organs, which is also known as organ trafficking. Today, we won't be discussing organ trafficking. While this is a very important issue globally, it is not pronounced in Canada. So we'll be focusing on human trafficking in Canada. Okay. So now we have a basic understanding of what human trafficking is. It's the exploitation of another person, in particular, the exploitation of their labor for the profit of another person. It also involves recruitment, moving the person, harboring or confining the person, and/or exercising control or immense influence over the movements of the person who's being exploited and the activities they engage in. One thing that's important to appreciate is that while human trafficking has been widely talked about over the past 2 decades, this isn't the first time Canada has been concerned with human trafficking. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, much of the growing white colonial population of Canada and the United States was immensely concerned and panicked about the mythic white slave trade. I use the term mythic here very intentionally, and the reason for that is that this white slave trade didn't actually exist. It lived predominantly in the minds of wealthy white men and women who were concerned about the virtue and purity of their daughters. Fueled and perpetuated by racism and anti-immigration attitudes towards non-white settlers, It included passing laws and legislation that prevented non-white business owners from employing white women. It placed restrictions on the ability of women of color to migrate to Canada, particularly women from China and Jamaica. And it placed legal restrictions on the ability of any woman to cross borders. So the result is that we have men of color as morally corrupt criminals and women of color as morally corrupt prostitutes. And an emphasis on the need to protect the purity and virtue of white women. The panic around the white slave trade died down during World War I, and the language of trafficking didn't return to Canada on the political stage until the late 1990s and early 2000s, accompanied by a heavy emphasis on young women, sex, and immigration. Now, what this tells us is that the language of human trafficking is powerful. It triggers an immense amount of public concern and panic. It also tells us that the language of human trafficking can be used strategically and deceptively by people in ways that are both racist and misogynist. This means that we should think critically about what human trafficking actually is, who is impacted by it, and in what ways, and also be aware of what human trafficking isn't. Now, moving forward, regular, current, popular depictions of human trafficking in mainstream media focus almost exclusively on what is referred to as sex trafficking. In these depictions, human trafficking is understood to be exclusively or predominantly the forced sexual exploitation of young women and girls in the dark and seedy sex industry, which is full of drugs and moral depravity. It is presented as the ultimate human rights abuse, as the worst imaginable form of exploitation, where women are kidnapped, chained, and repeatedly raped by men who pay their captors for access to their bodies. There is an emphasis on international organized crime syndicates and gangs, which are often depicted as being made up of men of color. There's also an emphasis on women and girls being passive, sexually innocent, and naive prior to being trafficked, and being utterly destroyed or dead as a result of it. Often these stories climax with a daring rescue where someone, generally a man, shows up, guns blazing, shooting down the traffickers, and rescuing any women that are still alive. These stories are reinforced by inaccurate statistics and estimates of the prevalence of human trafficking by NGOs, religious organizations, and government bodies. Okay, so what do I mean by inaccurate statistics? Well, a major problem with a lot of the most popular numbers on human trafficking is that they aren't actually based on methodologically sound evidence. In other words, there isn't agreement or consistency on what or who counts as being trafficked. Because of this, we have estimates that range from the tens of thousands to the tens to hundreds of millions. Many counts of human trafficking are based on the guesses of police and other groups, and the majority of these numbers conflate or smush together different populations under the umbrella of trafficking. For example, some groups count all homeless youth as being trafficked. Some count all women engaged in sex work as being trafficked. Some add both of these groups together and then increase the number arbitrarily because it is their belief that there must be more. We also run into this problem where, because people believe that all trafficking is actually sex-related, they only look for trafficking in the sex trades, and they only identify it as existing there. This means that people in trafficking situations outside this very narrow focus are left out. Taken together, these popular narratives often reinforce racist stereotypes that associate men of color with violence and criminality. They also create and reinforce a stereotype of what a trafficking victim looks like, as well as who can actually be a victim of trafficking. In addition, they present the solution to eliminating trafficking as increased policing and rescue operations. Now, the reality of human trafficking isn't nearly as simple as many of these stories we see in the news and on TV might suggest. In reality, human trafficking is situated on the far end of a spectrum of consent and exploitation, and experiences of trafficking can be found across a wide range of industries. Actual situations of trafficking tend to be complex and may be difficult for someone on the outside to readily identify. It's most common for a situation to start out as one that a person consents to, but as time goes on, the amount of control that person has over their circumstances and their ability to make meaningful decisions is severely reduced. For example, someone may consent to come to Canada to work as a migrant worker in the agricultural sector, but they may not agree to the horrible working conditions and living conditions they find themselves subjected to upon arrival. They may agree to work, but end up not being paid, having their documents withheld, or being physically, emotionally, psychologically, and/or sexually harassed and abused by their employer. The job they thought they were hired for may not exist, and their papers may not be legitimate. Because the visas of temporary foreign workers are tied to a single employer, the worker may end up in a situation where if they leave, they become illegal. Workers in these situations often end up being deported back to their home country, rather than being supported, provided with better working conditions, or being paid for their work, even though their experiences match definitions of human trafficking used by the Canadian government. Because they're not imagined to possibly have been trafficked, it's not labeled trafficking. Intimate relationships between people can also be or become abusive. And a person may find themselves in a trafficking situation where they're forced to become involved in criminalized activities, or where their body's ability to provide sexual services is exploited for another person's profit. Because trafficking most often occurs as a result of a progression from situations a person initially consented to situations where a person no longer has meaningful consent, the majority of persons who experience human trafficking do not receive the support they need. This is because their experiences don't fit the stereotypical narrative or idea of what trafficking looks like. In the stereotypical narrative, victims are kidnapped and only found through the heroic efforts of their rescuers. They are young, visibly harmed, and if they escape, it is clear that they are not the kind of girl that would ever voluntarily, for example, sell sex. It is also because a lot of anti-trafficking work is more focused on eliminating the sex industry for moral and religious reasons, rather than actually addressing and eliminating labor exploitation in a meaningful way across many industries. This draws on and reinforces the stigmatization and criminalization of sex work and the victim blaming that survivors of sexual violence often experience, because it implies that women who have sex outside of committed monogamous relationships are somehow deserving of abuse. And let's not forget that if victims of human trafficking can only be young women and children, where do gender nonconforming folks fit in? Where do men and boys fit in? Where do people who have passed the magical age of 30 fit in? Their experiences don't translate because they don't fit in this very narrow idea, this imagination of what trafficking is. These attitudes also combine with other forms of discrimination and inequality, including racism, misogyny, income inequality, poverty, homophobia, and transphobia. For example, in the case of Karina Raven, police held racist attitudes about Indigenous people and Indigenous women in particular. When she went to report her traffickers to police, they did not believe her. They assumed she was using drugs and selling sex to buy drugs. Because Indigenous women continue to experience widespread racism, they turned her away and put her at increased risk for harm. Because they didn't think she looked like a real trafficking victim, i.e. a white girl that Liam Neeson rescues in a movie called Taken, they didn't take her seriously or care for her well-being, safety, or human rights. This also means that sex workers who are best positioned to identify and help people leaving trafficking situations that occur in the sex trades are criminalized and discriminated against by anti-trafficking efforts, rather than being recognized for their valuable knowledge of the industry and the anti-trafficking efforts and support services that would make the biggest difference to those who actually need them. This is why it's incredibly important for us to develop a more nuanced understanding of what human trafficking actually looks like in practice. In reality, colonialism, poverty, homelessness, income inequality, misogyny, racism, xenophobia, these and other factors, apologies, we'll redo that sentence. These are all major factors that make it easier for people to dismiss actual experiences of trafficking. These are also the very same factors that are the actual root causes of human trafficking. How we think about human trafficking shapes the solutions we imagine. For example, if we imagine human trafficking as being perpetrated by evil criminals who kidnap and lock up their victims, the solutions will focus on increased policing, tighter immigration controls, and rescue operations that frequently perpetuate racist stereotypes and don't respond to reality. The funding for combating human trafficking will continue to go to organizations and government agencies that take this criminalize and rescue approach. This means that the majority of people who experience human trafficking will not be helped. It means that the structural factors, such as racism, poverty, and global income inequality, will continue to be erased and ignored. And this means that human trafficking will continue to happen. If we think about human trafficking as resulting from these structural factors, the solutions shift. And they shift to focus on eliminating things like poverty, racism, and other forms of inequality. Support for survivors comes to focus on anti-oppressive, non-judgmental harm reduction approaches that are inclusive of the diversity of experiences of survivors, both across and within different industries. We eliminate victim blaming, whorephobia, and slut shaming, and provide meaningful long-term health supports that respect people. It also changes the steps that we can take to keep ourselves and our communities safe. If we imagine trafficking victims to be predominantly kidnapped by criminals and insist that they conform in as many ways as possible to gendered social norms, we're helpless. If we recognize that trafficking is often the result of abusive relationships and exploitative working conditions, that the process is often gradual rather than sudden and immediate, then having conversations about consent, healthy relationships, and what a safe, respectful work environment looks like, these conversations have immense value because they will actually help. In any work to eliminate human trafficking, we always want to ensure that the work being done does not reinforce existing inequalities and forms of discrimination. There should never be, and there is no excuse for collateral damage. So, what can we do? What can you do? Quite a bit. I want you to think about what consent means to you. Think about what consent looks like in different kinds of relationships, relationships with your family, with your friends, with intimate partners, and so on. And I really want you to think about and reflect on and establish an idea of what consent looks like in intimate relationships, particularly intimate sexual relationships, because consent should always be active, enthusiastic, and ongoing. I want you to learn about the warning signs of abusive relationships, including indicators of emotional, psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. Check in with your friends if you notice their behavior changing, particularly if they're becoming more withdrawn. And do your best to create a safe, judgment-free space for them to share. You can know yourself, know your body, and know that you are deserving of respect and kindness. Learn about what consent looks like in the workplace. Learn about working conditions. Think about pay. Think about duties. Think about treatment in the workplace. And learn the warning signs of exploitation, including not being paid on time or the right amount. Learn about unsafe working conditions. Learn about what it means to have documentation withheld. Learn about forms of bullying, harassment, and violence in the workplace. Have conversations with friends and family about consent. Normalize it. It's okay. We should be talking about it, because if we don't talk about it, if we don't know ourselves, then it becomes so much harder to identify where our lines are, where our boundaries are, and when they're being crossed, when our consent, when our trust is being violated. This also connects to practicing self-care, including checking in with yourself and setting those healthy boundaries. You can also identify resources and supports in your community that you would feel comfortable using and that you would feel comfortable sharing with others if you encounter someone who might benefit from them. These are the kinds of things that should be readily available, right? We shouldn't have to go digging for support. We shouldn't have to go hunting for help. You are never alone. There are people there to provide you with support, and we want to encourage the expansion of those kind of supports. We can think critically about the language that we use, about what we see on TV, what we read in the news, and what we share on social media around issues of sex, around labor, around consent, and around human trafficking. And we can support organizations that are survivor-led and center anti-oppressive harm reduction approaches. In doing so, we want to also respect and acknowledge that not everyone uses the same language to describe their experiences, and that's okay. What I might label an experience might be different than what you label an experience, and that can be okay. But what we want to make sure is that when we're talking about something like human trafficking, when we're talking about things like consent, that we center the need to respect people, I have to put that front and center, and that regardless of our different religious, cultural, and so forth backgrounds, we don't impose our judgments and our ideas about what is right and what is the right kind of sex and what a relationship should look like on people. Instead, we want to recognize that it is essential for healthy relationships and healthy workplaces to be built on trust, communication, respect, dignity, and consent. If you would like to learn more about human trafficking and some of the themes that I've touched on in this discussion, I encourage you to check out the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, as well as Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, which is part of Open Democracy's resources. The Canadian Council for Refugees has some fantastic toolkits and information sources that you can dig into and share and get involved in advocacy around trafficking. Butterfly, the Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Network, has done a lot of work drawing attention to the way that migrant workers, in particular migrant sex workers, have experienced this collateral damage, this harm as a result of anti-trafficking approaches. And they really center the voices of migrant women in their work. You can also check out Swan Vancouver, who has some amazing, they put together some amazing anti-trafficking resources that are very accessible as well, plus the Challenging Trafficking in Canada policy brief that I mentioned. All of these resources are freely and readily available online, so no paywalls. They're easy to find. You can just plug them into Google and away you go. All right, I want to thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope it's been helpful. I hope you've learned a bit, maybe a lot. So take care, and thanks for watching.